You came all this way, Ethan said, his voice flat as the Montana sky. But I have to be honest with you. I didn't send for a wife because I wanted one. Clara had crossed 1,200 miles on a one-way ticket carrying one suitcase and everything she had left. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the train. She had not rehearsed this. The whole town was watching, and the man she had come to marry was already walking away. If this love story moves your heart, subscribe and follow Clara and Ethan to the very end and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Clara Bennett had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the train. She had rehearsed it somewhere between Kansas City and the open plains, when the landscape outside the window went from something familiar to something so wide and empty it took her breath away. She had rehearsed it in the middle of the night when the rocking of the car made sleep impossible, and she lay there in the dark with her hands folded over her stomach, running through everything she planned to say. She would step off the train. She would straighten her dress. She would extend her hand and say clearly, and without trembling, "Mr. Walker, I'm Clara Bennett. It's a pleasure to meet you." Simple, dignified. The kind of introduction that told a man exactly who he was dealing with before he had the chance to decide for himself. What she had not rehearsed was what to do when the man standing on the platform looked at her. Really looked at her, from the worn leather of her shoes to the single blue ribbon she had tied in her hair, because she wanted to look like someone worth meeting, and then looked away. Not with cruelty. That would have been easier to bear. With something worse. Resignation. "Miss Bennett." His voice was low, measured. The voice of a man who chose each word carefully because he had learned long ago that most of them weren't worth saying. "I'm Ethan Walker." "Mr. Walker." She kept her chin level. She had promised herself she would keep her chin level. "It's a pleasure." He didn't say it was a pleasure. He picked up her suitcase, the only piece of luggage she had, brown leather, with a broken clasp she'd fixed twice with twine, and turned toward the wagon, waiting at the edge of the platform. That was when the woman standing near the station door said it. Clara didn't know her name then. She learned it later. Margaret Holt, wife of the bank manager. The kind of woman who considered herself the final authority on everything that happened in Willow Creek, Montana. But in that moment, she was just a voice loud enough to carry over the sound of the wind and the distant lowing of cattle. "Well, she's not what I expected." Laughter from somewhere. Not much, just enough. Clara kept walking. She kept her chin level all the way to the wagon. She kept it level when Ethan helped her up without a word, when he climbed up beside her and took the reins, and clicked his tongue at the horses when they pulled away from the station and left the laughter and the staring eyes behind them. She kept her chin level for the first mile and the second, and somewhere in the middle of the third mile, when the town had disappeared behind them and there was nothing around them but the vast open country of Montana grass and sky and wind that didn't stop for anything, she let out a slow, quiet breath. She had not cried. She had not stumbled. She had not given anyone the satisfaction of watching her flinch. She considered that a victory. Ethan drove in silence. He had the kind of stillness that didn't feel uncomfortable so much as deliberate, like a man who had made peace with quiet a long time ago and didn't feel any particular need to disturb it. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, both hands easy on the reins, and if he was thinking anything about the woman sitting beside him, he kept it entirely to himself. Clara was the one who broke the silence because she had not come 1,200 miles to sit quietly and wait for someone else to decide the shape of her life. "How long have you owned the ranch?" she asked. A beat, like he was deciding whether the question deserved an answer. 11 years. Did you build it yourself? My father started it. I finished it. And the cattle? About 400 head. Might be more by spring if the weather holds. She nodded, filing this away. Who manages the house? He glanced at her then. Just a quick look sideways before his eyes went back to the road. I do. And the cooking? Ranch hand named Pete does most of it. The men eat in the bunkhouse. I eat alone. Every night. Every night. Clara looked at the land spreading out around them. It was beautiful in the way that big, indifferent things were beautiful, not because it was kind, but because it was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. "That sounds lonely," she said. The silence that followed lasted a full minute, maybe longer. "I manage," Ethan said finally. She believed him. That was almost the saddest part. Walker Ranch was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something orderly. A working ranch, yes, rough and practical, but organized in the way that a successful operation had to be organized. She had imagined a house that had been kept up at minimum to the standard of basic function. What she found was a house that had been kept up to the standard of a man who worked from before dawn to after dark every single day and had nothing left over for anything that didn't directly involve cattle. The kitchen was functional, but chaotic. Supplies were stored without any particular logic. There were gaps in the pantry that suggested someone had been buying things when they ran out, rather than keeping any kind of running inventory. The front room was clean enough, but bare in a way that felt less like simplicity and more like absence. Like someone had removed all the things that made a space feel lived in and hadn't noticed the difference. The house had 6 rooms. Clara counted them on that first walkthrough, keeping her expression neutral, while Ethan showed her each one with the efficiency of a man delivering a business report. Kitchen, pantry, front room. My office, you won't need to go in there. Your room's at the end of the hall. The men sleep in the bunkhouse. You'll have this house to yourself most of the time. He paused outside the door to her room. "It's not much," he said. And there was something in his voice that Clara hadn't expected, not an apology exactly, but something close to one, an acknowledgement that he knew the offering was small. She opened the door and looked in. A bed, a washstand, a window that faced east, which meant morning light. "It's fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once and turned to leave. "Mr. Walker." He stopped. "I understand that this arrangement is unconventional," Clara said carefully. "I understand we are strangers. I'm not expecting anything from you that you're not prepared to give, but I would ask one thing." He turned back to look at her. His expression hadn't changed, but he was listening. She could feel it. "Honesty," she said. "Whatever happens here, whatever you decide, I'd rather know the truth than be managed." He studied her for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not much, but enough to notice. "I can do that," he said. It was the most he had offered her since she stepped off the train. It was enough to start with. She met the ranch hands the next morning. There were 7 of them, not counting Pete, who ran the bunkhouse kitchen, and therefore considered himself in a separate category from the rest. They came in for breakfast in various states of wakefulness, filling the long table in the bunkhouse with boots and hats, and the particular kind of rough, easy noise that men made when they were comfortable in their surroundings. They stopped when they saw her standing at the doorway. Not hostile, just uncertain. The way people got when something changed in a routine they were comfortable with, and they hadn't decided yet whether the change was good or bad. "Men," Pete said from his position at the stove, with the particular tone of a man who had seen enough in his 50-some years not to be surprised by much. "This is Miss Bennett. She'll be staying at the house." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a young man at the far end of the table, maybe 19 with red hair and an open face, said, "Morning, ma'am." That broke the ice. The others followed a rough chorus of good mornings and hat tips, and Clara smiled at each of them in turn and said good morning back, and made sure she was looking at their faces when she did it, not at the table or the floor, because she had learned a long time ago that people remembered the ones who looked them in the eye. "I'm going to be honest with you," she said before Pete could try to shoo her back to the house. "I don't know your routines yet. I don't know what you need or how things work here. I'm not going to pretend otherwise." She paused. "But I'm a quick learner, and I'd rather ask a foolish question once than make the same mistake twice." Another beat of silence. Then Pete from the stove said, "You want coffee?" "I'd love some," Clara said. The young man with the red hair, she learned his name was Tommy, slid over on the bench to make room, and Clara sat down among 7 ranch hands she'd never met before, drank the strongest coffee she'd ever tasted in her life, and listened. That was the real thing they didn't tell you about new places. The way in was always through listening. She had been at Walker Ranch for 4 days when she first saw Ethan lose his temper. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't involve shouting or throwing things, or the kind of performance that men sometimes put on to show they were still in control of something. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse for it. She was in the kitchen when she heard him outside, his voice, low and tight, speaking to someone in the yard. She couldn't make out the words at first, just the tone, and the tone was different enough from his usual flat steadiness that she went still and listened. She heard another voice. Higher, almost conciliatory. Someone apologizing. Then Ethan's voice again. I don't need an apology. I need it done right the first time. A pause. Get it fixed before tonight. Then the sound of his boots on the porch steps, and he came through the kitchen door and stopped when he saw her. For just a moment she saw it. The tension in his jaw, the flat, dark look in his eyes that said he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere behind a wall she hadn't been given any directions to. Then he blinked, and it was gone, smoothed over by whatever discipline he used to keep himself in check. Sorry, he said. Didn't know you were in here. Don't be. Clara turned back to the counter, giving him the courtesy of not staring. Water's hot if you want tea. A pause. I don't drink tea. Coffee then. She heard him pull out the chair at the kitchen table. She hadn't expected that she'd expected him to take whatever he came in for and leave and sit down. She poured 2 cups and brought them to the table and sat across from him because she had decided in her first 4 days at Walker Ranch that the only way she was going to understand this man was to be in the same room as him and pay attention. Is it always like this? She asked. The managing of it. Ethan wrapped his hands around his cup. Like what? All of it at once. The men, the cattle, the suppliers, the weather. Everything depending on every other thing. He looked at her. You noticed that... It's hard not to. She traced the grain of the table with one finger. One thing goes wrong, and it pulls at 3 other things. Like a knot pulled tight from the wrong end. He was quiet for a moment. My father used to say the same thing. He was right. Something in his expression shifted barely enough to see, like a door opening the width of a crack, and no more. He was, Ethan said. About most things. It was more than he'd told her in 4 days combined. She didn't push for more. She drank her coffee and let the silence settle back over them, comfortable this time, instead of cold, and made a mental note. This man didn't give things easily. He gave them slowly, one small piece at a time, and the worst thing you could do was grab for more before he was ready. She could be patient. She had been patient for a long time. The thing about Walker Ranch that nobody had warned her about was the sheer relentlessness of it. Not the work. She had known there would be work. She was the daughter of a woman who had raised 4 children on a school teacher's wage after her husband died, and she had learned what work meant before she was old enough to spell the word. What she hadn't expected was the way the ranch never stopped. There was no end to the day, in any clean, definable sense. There was just the point where the light ran out, and you moved the work inside, and then the point a few hours later, where your body gave out, and you stopped, and then the point a few hours after that, where it started again. She learned the rhythm of it inside a week. She was up before the sun because the kitchen fire had to be going before anyone came in from the bunkhouse. She did the things that needed doing, not because anyone told her to, but because she had eyes, and she could see what needed doing, and she did them without making a production of it, because she had learned early that the kind of help that came with an expectation of being noticed for it was the kind that left people feeling more burdened than before. The men noticed anyway. Tommy noticed on day 3 when he came in from a long morning of fence repair and found that someone had left a pot of stew warming on the stove and a note that said, "Eat before it gets cold." He mentioned it to the others. She heard about it from Pete, who told her with the cautious approval of a man who wasn't ready to commit to a full endorsement, but was clearly moving in that direction. "You didn't have to do that," Pete told her. "No," Clara agreed. "I didn't." A pause. They worked a long shift, she added. People work better when they know someone noticed. Pete looked at her for a long moment. You done this kind of work before? Not this exact kind, she said honestly. But people are people. He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dissent and went back to whatever he was doing. But the next morning, he moved over and made room for her at the stove without being asked, and that she had learned was Pete's version of a warm welcome. It was on a Thursday, 12 days after she arrived, that Ethan Walker did something she hadn't seen him do before. He asked for her opinion. They were in the front room after supper. She was mending one of the supply bags that had come apart at the seam. He was going over papers at the desk in the corner, and he said without looking up, "What do you think about the east pasture rotation?" Clara looked up from her mending. "I'm sorry. The east pasture." He set down his pen. "I've been running the cattle through it on a 12-week cycle. Tommy thinks we should cut it to 8. I think 12 is right, but—" He stopped. "You've been watching the operation." "I have." "What do you think?" She put down her mending. "I think Tommy's not wrong about the grass, but he's not accounting for the water access in the dry months. 8 weeks in spring is fine. In summer you'd be pushing them back before the waters had time to recover." Ethan stared at her. "My father had a farm," she said in answer to the look. "Not cattle, but the principles are the same." A long pause. 12 weeks, Ethan said. 12 weeks, Clara agreed. He picked up his pen again. She picked up her mending. The fire crackled between them, and outside the wind moved across the Montana grass, and neither of them said anything else for the rest of the evening. But before he went to bed, Ethan Walker paused in the doorway of the front room and said without turning around, "Thank you." Just that, 2 words. Clara didn't look up from her mending. "Good night, Mr. Walker." She heard him go. She sat alone in the firelight for a long while, after her hands still on the half-mended bag, listening to the wind outside and the silence inside, and she thought, there he is. Not the wall, not the careful distance, not the man who picked up her suitcase without a word and drove her through the Montana country with his eyes fixed forward. The real one. The one underneath. There he is. She had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when Margaret Holt came to call. She arrived in the late morning in a neat buggy with matching horses, wearing a hat that said she had spent real money on it and wanted you to know. She knocked on the front door with the authority of a woman who expected it to be answered immediately, and when Clara opened it, she smiled the way people smiled when they were already deciding what they thought of you. "Miss Bennett." A pause measuring. "I heard you were settling in." "Mrs. Holt." Clara stepped back from the door. "Would you like to come in?" She came in. She sat in the front room and accepted the cup of tea Clara made and looked around the space with the patient, methodical attention of someone compiling a list. "It's a bit sparse," she said finally, "though I suppose that's Ethan's way. He never did have much interest in the domestic side of things." A meaningful pause. "His first well. We don't need to go into that." "No," Clara agreed pleasantly. "We don't." Margaret Holt's eyes sharpened. She had expected either discomfort or curiosity, and Clara had given her neither. "I want to be frank with you," Margaret said. "This town looks after its own. And Ethan Walker is, well, he's one of ours. He's been through enough. People around here want to see him taken care of properly." "That's very kind," Clara said. "What I mean to say is—" Margaret paused, recalibrating. "A mail-order arrangement is all very well, but it's not love, is it? And Ethan deserves love. Real love." Clara set down her cup very carefully. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "may I ask you something?" A gracious nod. "When you were first married to Mr. Holt, did you love him on the day you met him?" A flicker. "That's different." "Is it?" "We were introduced properly, through family. It's not the same as answering an advertisement." Clara kept her voice even. "I'm not sure the heart makes that distinction. Are you—" Margaret Holt opened her mouth and closed it again. Clara picked up her cup. More tea. The older woman left 20 minutes later, spine very straight and expression carefully neutral. Clara watched the buggy until it disappeared down the road, then went back inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, both hands flat on the counter, breathing. Then she picked up the inventory list she'd been working on before the knock at the door and went back to work. She had not come here to win the town's approval, but she would not give them the satisfaction of watching her crumble either. The first real crack in Ethan Walker's armor appeared on a Sunday. It was late afternoon. The men were in the bunkhouse. The ranch was as quiet as it ever got, which was not very quiet, but a different kind of noisy wind and animals, and the distant sound of someone hammering something in the barn, instead of the closer human noise of 7 men going about their work. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard the door to Ethan's office open and close, and then his footsteps, and then nothing. He had stopped somewhere in the front room. She waited. After a long moment, she walked to the doorway. He was standing at the window that faced west, hands at his sides, looking out at something she couldn't see from her angle. He had the particular stillness of a man who had stopped moving because he'd run out of the momentum that kept him going. "Ethan," she said. He turned around, and for just a moment he shut down. Almost immediately, pulled the door closed on it so fast she almost missed it. She saw something raw on his face. Not grief exactly, something older than that. Something that had been there long enough that he'd stopped calling it anything at all. "Sorry," he said. "Just thinking. About the ranch. A beat. About a lot of things." Clara stayed in the doorway. She didn't go toward him, didn't press, just stayed where she was and let him have the room and the window and whatever he was carrying. "My father died in the fall," he said. 7 years ago. This time of year He stopped, started again. "The light is different in the fall." "Yes," Clara said softly. "It is. He built the east fence himself, spent 2 weeks on it. I used to ride out there and watch him work. I thought then that I'd never see anything he couldn't do." Clara said nothing. She waited. "He died with the ranch still in debt," Ethan continued. "Nothing serious, nothing we couldn't manage. But he never knew he'd gotten out from under it. I paid off the last of it 6 months after." He paused. He never knew. The silence that followed was long and heavy, and she let it be both of those things without trying to make it lighter. "That's a hard thing to carry," she said finally. "Yes." "He knew what kind of man you were going to be," she said. "I think that was enough." Ethan looked at her. "You don't know that," he said. But it wasn't a challenge. It was almost wondering. "No," she agreed. "I don't, but I know what I see." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was very still in a different way now. Not the deliberate stillness of a man keeping himself contained, but something quieter. Like water that had stopped moving, not because it was frozen, but because it had found level ground. "You're not what I expected," he said. "I know," Clara said. She went back to the kitchen. She gave him the window and the west light and whatever he needed to do with a Sunday afternoon and a 7-year-old grief. She thought walking back to the counter that she was beginning to understand him. Not fully, not yet, but she was beginning to see the shape of him, the real shape, the one underneath the walls, and the careful distance, and the eyes that looked at her, sometimes like he wasn't sure what to do with the fact that she was still there. He was a man who had decided that love was a thing that happened to you once, and when it ended, you built something else in its place and kept going. He had built a very good ranch. But he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work. Clara had known that kind of tired. She had felt it herself after her mother died, after the money ran out, after the town she'd grown up in made it quietly clear that a young woman without resources or connections or the right kind of name was more or less on her own. She had answered an advertisement in a newspaper, and she had packed her one suitcase, and she had gotten on a train, and she had kept her chin level. She was still keeping it level, and somewhere in the process, somewhere between the first cup of coffee in the bunkhouse and the East pasture discussion and the Sunday afternoon with the west light, she had started to feel for the first time, in a long time, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was easy. Not because Ethan Walker had opened his arms and welcomed her home, but because this was real work, real people, real land, and she was good at it. She was better at it every day. And the man at the desk in the office down the hall with his walls and his grief and his careful, deliberate quiet was beginning slowly, barely 1 degree at a time, to let her in. She was not a woman who needed to be rescued, but she was. She realized, standing alone in the kitchen with both hands flat on the counter and the autumn light coming through the window, a woman who was very glad she had come. She had been at Walker Ranch for exactly 1 month when she found the ledger. Not snooping. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She had been looking for a blank notebook to start an inventory system, something the ranch desperately needed and did not have, and she had opened the wrong drawer in the front room cabinet, and there it was. A worn brown ledger, thick with pages, the kind that serious men use to track serious money. She almost closed the drawer. Then she saw the numbers. Not all of them, just enough. A column of outgoing expenses on the left side of one open page, and a column of incoming revenue on the right, and the gap between them was not catastrophic, but it was not comfortable either, and what caught her eye was not the size of the gap, but the pattern of it. The way certain expenses recurred at irregular intervals. The way one supplier's invoices came in slightly higher every 3rd month, so gradually that if you weren't looking for it, you would never see it. Clara had been a bookkeeper's assistant for 2 years before her mother got sick, and she had to stop. She knew what regular expenses looked like. She knew what irregular ones looked like, too. She closed the drawer without touching the ledger. She stood in the front room for a moment, both hands at her sides, thinking about what she had seen and what it might mean, and whether it was her place to say anything at all. Then she went to find Pete. "How long has Harlan been supplying the ranch?" she asked, keeping her voice easy, conversational, the way you had to keep things when you were asking questions you didn't want to seem like questions. Pete looked up from the harness he was repairing. "Harlan. Going on 4 years, I suppose. Why?" "Just getting to know the operation," she said. Pete went back to the harness. "Good man. Known Ethan a while. Takes care of the ranch." Clara nodded and went back inside. She thought about it for 3 days before she said anything to Ethan. She waited until a Thursday evening when the men were settled in the bunkhouse and the house was quiet, and Ethan was at his desk, doing what he did every evening, going over the day's numbers with the focused, exhausted efficiency of a man who was also his own accountant, because he didn't trust anyone else to do it right. She knocked on the open door of the office. He looked up. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to hear me out before you decide what you think of it." Something sharpened in his expression. "All right." She came in and stood at the edge of the desk and told him what she had seen. Not dramatically, not with any particular weight, just the facts plainly, the pattern in the invoices, the gradual escalation, the irregularity that only showed up if you were looking at all the months together instead of one at a time. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You were in my ledger," he said. "I opened the wrong drawer. I closed it without taking anything out." Another silence. Longer. "Show me," he said. She brought him the ledger. He pulled it out. Himself. She didn't touch it and opened it to the page she had seen, and then to the next 3 months, and then to the records going back 2 years. And she pointed out the pattern without touching the numbers, just tracing the column in the air above the page. She watched his face while he looked. She watched him see it. "How did I miss that?" he said. It was not a question. It was something a man said to himself when he realized he had been too tired and too busy and too trusting to notice something he should have noticed. "You were looking at each month by itself," Clara said quietly. "It's only visible when you put them together." Ethan closed the ledger. He set his hands flat on the cover of it and looked at the wall for a moment. "That's 8 months," he said. "At least. And you noticed it in one look." "I was trained to notice it," she said. My employer in Cincinnati was very particular about invoice consistency. He used to say that the biggest losses never happened all at once. They happened in small amounts over a long time to people who were too busy watching the big picture to see the small one. Ethan looked at her. "Who trained you?" he asked. "A man named Garrett. He ran a dry goods import company. I worked for him for 2 years. Where did you learn accounting?" "My mother taught me numbers. Mr. Garrett taught me what to do with them." Silence. The fire in the corner of the office snapped once settling. "I need to look at everything going back 4 years," Ethan said. "I know," Clara said. "I can help if you want it." He looked at her for a long moment. A measuring look, but different from the measuring look he'd given her at the train station. That one had been a man deciding what category to put her in. This one was a man realizing the category he'd already assigned her was wrong. "I want it," he said. They worked until 2 in the morning. The thing about working alongside someone in the middle of the night, when everything else in the world had gone quiet, and there was nothing around you but lamplight and numbers, and the sound of each other breathing, was that it stripped away a great deal of the distance that accumulated during the daylight hours. Ethan was a different person when he was working. Not warmer exactly, but more present, more there. The careful, measured quality he carried through most of his waking hours was still there, but it was focused now instead of guarded, pointed at the problem instead of wrapped around himself. He asked good questions, sharp ones. He caught things she pointed out quickly and connected them to things she hadn't mentioned yet, which meant he had been holding more of the ranch's financial picture in his head than she'd realized. "You already suspected something," she said somewhere around midnight when she noticed the way he nodded at the third pattern without any sign of surprise. He didn't answer right away. "I noticed the cash was tighter than it should have been," he said finally. "Given the herd size and the price of beef this year, the margins should have been better. I thought it was the winter costs." A pause. "Or I told myself it was the winter costs." "Because the other explanation was harder. Because Harlan has been supplying this ranch since before my father died," Ethan said. "He knew my father. He came to the funeral." His voice was flat, but flatness sometimes meant the opposite of what it sounded like. "I trusted him." Clara didn't say anything about trust. She didn't say anything about betrayal. She picked up her pen and went back to the numbers because that was what the moment needed, not words. An hour later, when they had laid out everything they were going to find that night, Ethan sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "How much?" he said. Clara looked at the final column. "Somewhere between $300 and $400 over 4 years, depending on what the actual supply costs should have been." "That's not enough to ruin me." "No," she said, "but it's enough to tell you what kind of man you've been dealing with." Ethan looked at the ledger. Then he looked at her. "Why didn't you just tell me the first day you saw it?" She considered the question honestly. "Because I didn't know you yet," she said. "I didn't know if you'd hear it, or if you'd hear it as me overstepping. And I didn't know what Harlan meant to you. And now you know." "Enough," she said. He was quiet for a long moment. "You could have just left it alone," he said. "It didn't affect you." Clara set down her pen. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to really hear it." He looked at her. "This ranch," she said carefully, "is not just yours. Not anymore. Whatever we decide about the future, whatever this arrangement becomes or doesn't become right now, in this moment, I am part of this place. These men work here. This is where I wake up in the morning and where I go to sleep at night." She held his gaze. "What affects you affects this ranch, and what affects this ranch affects me. So yes, it involved me. It always did." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Ethan Walker looked at the woman sitting across the desk from him with her dark eyes and her straight spine and her ink-stained fingers. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train at Willow Creek Station, he looked at her like she was actually there. Not a stranger occupying space in his house. Not an obligation he'd taken on because the ranch needed managing. Someone who was there. Someone who was in some way he hadn't named yet and wasn't ready to name his. "Thank you," he said. It was the second time he'd said those words to her. But this time they were different. She could hear the difference. The next morning, Ethan rode into town and had a conversation with Harlan Beecham that nobody in Willow Creek ever got the full story of, because Ethan Walker was not the kind of man who made his business into a public spectacle. What everyone did see was Harlan's wagon leaving the Walker Ranch property line the following week for the last time, and Ethan Walker shaking hands with a younger supplier from the next county over, and the expression on Margaret Holt's face when she heard about it, which said very clearly that she knew exactly what had changed at Walker Ranch, and she was not entirely sure how to feel about it. What nobody saw was the conversation Clara and Ethan had that evening when he came back from the final meeting with a quietness about him that was different from his usual quiet. "It's done," he said. "Good," she said. He sat down at the kitchen table without being asked, which was something he had started doing more often in the past 2 weeks. She put coffee in front of him and sat across from him and waited. "He said he thought I wouldn't notice," Ethan said. "That was what he actually said, that I was too busy with the cattle to look at the numbers." Clara kept her expression steady. "What did you say?" "I said he was right." A pause. "And that it wouldn't happen again." She nodded. "I've been running this ranch for 11 years, Ethan said. "I know cattle, I know land, I know weather and grass and water and what it takes to keep 400 animals alive through a Montana winter." He looked at his hands. "I didn't know I needed someone to watch the other side of it." "Nobody can watch everything at once," Clara said. "My father could." "Your father had a partner," she said, gently but directly. "He had your mother." The words landed somewhere she could see them landing in the slight shift of his jaw, the quick look at the table. "He did," Ethan said, quietly. "You've been doing it alone for a long time." "Yes." "That's not strength," she said. "That's just endurance." He looked up at her. She held his gaze and didn't flinch. "There's a difference," she added softly. Ethan Walker didn't say anything for a long time. He drank his coffee. The kitchen was warm. Outside she could hear Tommy and another hand talking in the yard, the sound of their boots on the hard ground, the ordinary sounds of the ranch going on around them. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She noticed. She didn't show that she noticed. "I owe you an apology," he said, "for how I was when you arrived. I wasn't—" He stopped. "I wasn't unkind. I know that. But I wasn't—" "You weren't there," she supplied. He looked at her. "Yes. I know," she said. "I wasn't asking you to be. Not then. And now—" She looked at him, at the set of his face and the calluses on his hands, and the particular way he held himself when he was being careful with something fragile, which she was beginning to recognize. "Now I think we're both figuring it out," she said. He nodded, just once. But something in the set of his shoulders was different when he got up from the table, fractionally lighter, like a man who had set something down and wasn't sure yet whether he was allowed to walk away from it. He paused at the kitchen door. "The men respect you," he said. "I wanted you to know." She looked down at the counter. "They respect the stew." She heard something she had not heard from him before. A sound, low, brief, almost surprised out of him. A laugh. She looked up just in time to see at the corner of his mouth, just the corner before he turned and went out the door. Clara stood in the warm kitchen for a moment alone with her hands flat on the counter and something new moving in her chest. Careful, she told herself. But her hands were not entirely steady. "'Kay." It was Tommy who said it out loud, because Tommy was 19 and had not yet learned the particular adult skill of keeping observations to himself. He said it on a Thursday morning passing through the kitchen, while Clara was making the supply list without any preamble or apparent awareness of the significance of the statement. "Ethan smiled at breakfast," he said. Clara kept writing. "Did he? He doesn't usually." Tommy poured himself water from the pitcher on the counter. Pete noticed too. Said he couldn't remember the last time. People change, Clara said. Tommy looked at her with the direct, guileless attention of someone who had not yet complicated his perceptions with tact. You're different from what I thought you'd be, he said. When we heard he was getting a mail-order bride, we all thought... He stopped. What did you think, she asked. That she'd be... He searched for the word. Soft. Someone he'd have to take care of. He shook his head. You'd take care of us. Clara set down her pen. She looked at Tommy, this red-haired 19-year-old who worked harder than men twice his age and hadn't yet built the walls that hard work eventually made most men build. You take care of each other, she said. I just make sure nobody forgets to eat. Tommy grinned. It transformed his whole face. Well, he said, the stew helps. He went back out to the yard. Clara picked up her pen, but she was smiling. The first time someone in town said something kind to her, she was so prepared for the opposite that she almost missed it. She was at the general store, something she did every 2 weeks now, with a proper list, because she had established a supply system that worked, and she was not about to let it fall apart for lack of maintenance when the woman behind her in line said, You're the one out at Walker Ranch, aren't you? Not a question, just a statement of fact. I am, Clara said. The woman was maybe 60, with the kind of face that had seen a lot of weather and made peace with all of it. I'm Edna Marsh. My husband runs the mill on the North Road. Clara Bennett, Clara said. I heard what you did with Harlan Beecham, Edna said. Clara went still. I heard he'd been cheating Ethan Walker for years. Edna continued calmly. And that you're the one who found it. She paused. Harlan did the same thing to us 4 years back. My husband figured it out eventually, but it took him a long time, and by the time he knew the money was gone. Clara looked at her. I'm glad somebody finally caught him at it, Edna said simply, and I'm glad it was before he did more damage to that ranch than he already did. She paid for her goods and left. Clara stood at the counter for a moment. Then she paid for her own goods and walked back to the wagon. It was a small thing. 1 woman, 1 sentence. But in a place where she had spent the first weeks feeling watched and measured and found wanting by people who had decided what she was before she opened her mouth, it was not nothing. She thought driving back to the ranch with the supply boxes in the wagon bed that she was beginning to understand this town the way she was beginning to understand Ethan Walker. Slowly. 1 small piece at a time. By paying attention. It was the only way she knew how to do anything that mattered. The weather turned cold on a Friday in October, the kind of cold that arrived not gradually, but all at once, like a door slammed open somewhere up in the mountains, and the temperature fell through overnight. By morning, 2 of the older hands were sick. Nothing serious. Heavy colds, raw throats, the kind of thing that came every year when the seasons changed, but sick enough that they needed to be out of the cold, and that meant the work they would normally have done needed to be divided among the men who were left. Ethan redistributed assignments at breakfast without complaint from anyone, because this was the kind of thing that happened on ranches, and everyone understood it. What he did not anticipate was Clara putting on her coat and following the men out. He caught her at the door. "What are you doing?" he said. "Going to help with the supply line," she said. "Tommy's running 1 man short on the feed distribution. It'll take him twice as long alone." "That's physical work." "I'm aware." "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." He looked at her coat, and her expression, and the absolute unwavering certainty in her posture. "You don't know how," he said. "Then show me," she said. "Or let Tommy show me. Either way it gets done faster." A long pause. "The bags weigh 40 pounds, he said. "Then I'll carry 30-pound loads and make more trips," she said. "The math still works." Something moved across his face. She couldn't read it exactly. It wasn't amusement, wasn't surprise, was something adjacent to both. "Fine," he said. "Stay near Tommy." She went. She made more trip than Tommy. She didn't complain once. By mid-afternoon, when the last of the feed was distributed and her arms ached in a way that she suspected would still be felt on Monday. Tommy looked at her with an expression she recognized as genuine respect. Not the careful, polite respect people extended to women they didn't know what to do with, but the real kind, the kind that came from watching someone do a job alongside you. "You're all right, Miss Bennett," he said. "Don't tell anyone," she said. "I have a reputation to maintain." He laughed. She laughed too. They walked back through the cold air together, and Clara's arms ached, and her hands were raw, and she had never in recent memory felt more like herself. Ethan was at the barn when they came back. He looked at her. He looked at Tommy. "Done," he said. "All done," Tommy said. "She carried the East Run herself." Ethan looked at her. Just looked. The kind of look she was learning, the one that said he was seeing more than she'd put on display, filing it somewhere he would think about later. "Go inside," he said. "You'll be cold." "I'm fine," she said. "Clara," he said. The name, again. Still doing something to the air when he said it. "Go inside," he said. "I'll be in for supper." She went inside. She stood in the warm kitchen and let her arms ache and put water on to heat and thought about the way he had said her name. Just her name. Nothing before or after it. And she thought something is changing here. Something quiet and slow and larger than either of them had planned for. November arrived with snow, and the snow arrived with trouble. Not the catastrophic kind, not yet. But the slow-building, pressure-accumulating kind that was sometimes worse because it crept up on you while you were watching the obvious problems and didn't announce itself until the moment it became unavoidable. It started with the bank. Ethan came home from town on a Wednesday with a different kind of quiet around him. Not the comfortable, contained quiet she had grown used to reading. A tight quiet. The kind that meant something had happened that he was processing alone because he had spent a lifetime processing things alone. She let him be through supper. She let him be while she cleaned up. She let him be while he sat at his desk with the ledger open, but not she noticed looking at it. Then she brought him coffee, not tea. She had learned what he liked and sat down across from him without asking. He looked up. "The bank has concerns," he said. "About what?" "The note on the ranch. We had a good year, but not good enough to put us where they want us to be." A pause. "The new man they sent Carlisle from the regional office, he's not—" He stopped. "He doesn't know this ranch. He doesn't know what it's worth. All he knows is a number on a page. How much time did he give you?" 6 months. To bring the margins up to their standard." His jaw was tight. 11 years of payments, never a day late, and now they're sending a new man from the city who thinks this ranch is the number on a page. Clara looked at the ledger, then at him. "Can we get there?" she asked. "In 6 months?" He was quiet. "Possibly," he said. "If the spring prices hold, if we don't lose any cattle to the winter, if—" He stopped. Too many ifs. "Let me look at the numbers," she said. "Clara, Ethan." She held his gaze. "Let me look at the numbers." He pushed the ledger across the desk to her. She took it. She opened it to the current month. She began to read. He watched her read. She felt his eyes on her face while she worked through the columns, turning pages, going back, cross-referencing. She did not rush. She did not perform. She simply worked the way she always worked, with her full attention and the particular focused quiet that she had learned from a lifetime of needing to be accurate when accuracy mattered. 20 minutes later, she looked up. "There are 3 places where we can reduce the outgoing without hurting the operation," she said. "And 1 place where a small investment now will save us significantly in the spring." He leaned forward. "Show me." She showed him. They worked until midnight, and somewhere between the numbers and the lamplight and the quiet house and the way he leaned toward the page when she pointed to something significant, the word "we" had stopped being a thing either of them had to think about before they said it. It was just what they said now. We, the ranch, the problem, the plan. We. The plan they built that night was good. Clara knew it was good the same way she knew when numbers were right. Not with excitement, not with pride, but with a quiet internal settling, like a key turning cleanly in a lock. They had found the cuts that would not bleed the operation. They had found the investment that would pay back in spring. They had given themselves a map through the next 6 months, and the map was honest, which was the only kind worth having. What neither of them had planned for was what arrived in the first week of December. It started with the storm. 3 days of it brutal and relentless, the kind of Montana winter weather that old-timers talked about in the specific reverent way that people talked about things that had beaten them. The temperature dropped to levels that made the horses nervous, and the cattle cluster together in the far corner of the south pasture, and by the time the wind stopped on the 3rd day, Walker Ranch had lost 11 head of cattle to the cold. 2 sections of the east fence Ethan's father had built, and the use of the storage barn on the north end of the property where a support beam had given way under the weight of the accumulated ice. 11 cattle, 2 fence sections, 1 barn. Clara stood with Ethan in the yard after the storm broke both of them in their heaviest coats, and she watched him look at what the 3 days had taken, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was absorbing damage, going very still, going very controlled, the jaw setting in a way that meant he was taking the full weight of it and deciding whether he could still stand under it. "All right," he said. Just that. All right. Not a statement of acceptance, a decision to move forward. "The fence is the first priority," he said, already turning. "Tommy, take Jenkins and Morrison to the east line. I'll pull the cattle count with Pete." He was moving before he finished the sentence. Clara went to the supply barn and started pulling inventory. They worked for 4 days straight. Everyone did. There was no dividing the men into those whose job it was and those whose job it wasn't, because that was not how emergencies worked on a ranch, and everyone at Walker Ranch understood emergencies. Clara cooked in bulk and left food where men could grab it without stopping. She ran supply counts. She tracked what was damaged and what was salvageable and what needed to be replaced, and she kept the lists in her head until she could get them on paper, and she did not once ask whether this was her role or someone else's. By the 4th day, the fence was repaired, the cattle were accounted for, and the damage inventory was complete. Ethan sat down at the kitchen table that evening, and Clara put the list in front of him. He read it. She watched his face while he did. "This is manageable," she said. "Painful, but manageable. The cattle loss hurts, but not fatally. The barn needs the beam replaced before we can use it, but that's carpentry, not construction. The fence." "I know about the fence," he said. "I know you do." She kept her voice level. "I'm telling you, it's survivable. I want you to hear that from me. Before you go somewhere, I can't follow you." He looked up. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means you get a look in your eyes sometimes," she said. "When the weight gets heavy, where you go somewhere inside yourself and close the door, and from the outside that looks like a man deciding he has to carry everything alone again." The silence was long. "I've been carrying it alone for a long time," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm saying you don't have to, not anymore, not while I'm here." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his face, not the careful, controlled shift she was used to seeing, but something deeper, something that came from a place he didn't usually let be visible. "The barn beam will cost $40 to replace," he said finally, "which we have. The cattle loss will show up in the spring count, which will affect the bank's numbers." "By how much?" "Enough to matter." He pushed the list back toward her. "Run it against what we built last month. Tell me where we land." She pulled the ledger from the shelf where it lived now, not in his office, but here in the kitchen where they both used it, and opened it to the projection they had built together. She worked through it while he drank his coffee. She took her time. She checked twice. When she looked up, she kept her face neutral because the news was not good, but it was not fatal, and the way you delivered information mattered as much as the information itself. "We're short of where Carlisle wants us by spring," she said. "Not by much, but enough that he'll have grounds to push." Ethan nodded. "How short?" She told him the number. He was quiet. "There's a solution," she said. He looked at her. The winter supply contract, she said. The one you turned down in September from the fort. They were willing to pay premium rates for guaranteed delivery. I turned it down because I wasn't sure of our numbers at the time. I know, but you can go back to them. If you can guarantee delivery through February, which, given the herd size, even with the loss, the premium payment lands exactly where we need it. Ethan stared at her. How long have you known about that contract? He said. Since October. Pete mentioned it. I looked up the standard rates and kept it in the back of my mind in case we needed it. She paused. We need it. Another long silence. You've been holding that in reserve, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It wasn't quite not one either. I was hoping we wouldn't need it, she said honestly. A guaranteed delivery contract in winter is a risk. If we have another storm like the one we just had, we could default. I didn't want to propose a risk unless the alternative was worse. And now? Now the alternative is worse, she said. Ethan picked up his coffee, put it down without drinking. If we default on the delivery, he said, we won't. But if we do, the penalty is $100 and a damaged reputation with the fort, which would hurt. But the fort contract is a choice. Losing the banknote is not. He was quiet for a full minute. Then, draft the letter to the fort. I'll ride in tomorrow and send it. Already started, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. You started it before I agreed, he said. I drafted it, she said. I wasn't going to send it without you, but time matters, and I didn't want to waste a day if you said yes. He was still looking at her. Something in his expression she was beginning to read differently than she used to. Not watchfulness, not wariness. Something that was, if she was being honest with herself, close to wonder. Clara, he said. Ethan? What would this ranch do without you? It was not she noticed a question. She picked up her pen. Sign the letter when I finish it, she said. The twist came from a direction neither of them had been looking. They had been watching Carlisle. They had been watching the bank's numbers. They had been watching the weather. What they had not been watching was Gerald Moss. Gerald Moss was a land speculator from Billings, the kind of man who wore good suits and shook hands warmly, and had a way of being everywhere that mattered without ever seeming to try. He had been in Willow Creek since October, which Clara had noted in the same vague peripheral way she noted most things in town, filed away without urgency, waiting to become relevant. It became relevant on a Tuesday afternoon in December when Ethan came home from a supply run with the tight, quiet face he got when something had happened that he was still deciding how to feel about. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him. She waited. Moss made an offer on the ranch, he said. Clara went still. When? He pulled me aside at the general store, said he'd heard about the storm damage, said he had a fair offer ready if I wanted to avoid the headache of the bank situation. Ethan's voice was flat. Said he'd heard we were behind on the note. Clara set down her cup very carefully. How would he know that? He didn't say. How would he know the exact number we're behind? She said, because she was thinking out loud, now working it through. The bank wouldn't share that. Only Carlisle knows the specifics, and Carlisle has no reason to... She stopped. Ethan was watching her face. Say it, he said. What does Carlisle look like? She said. A beat. About 40. Dark hair. Good coat. Why? Did you see him in the general store with Moss last week? Ethan went very still. No, he said. But I saw them outside the hotel 2 weeks ago. I didn't think... Because there was no reason to think, Clara said. 2 men outside a hotel is nothing, unless one of them is your banker and the other is offering to buy your land at a discount right after that banker told you you're at risk. The silence in the kitchen was different from all the silences that had come before it. That's not a coincidence, Ethan said. No, Clara said. I don't think it is. He stood up. She could feel the anger in him, the sudden white-hot kind that came from a man who had spent his whole life being straight with people and could not immediately process discovering he had been maneuvered. "I need to go into town," he started. "No," she said. He looked at her. "Not yet," she said. "If you go in angry, you show them that you know. And if they know you know, they'll cover what they've done before we can prove it." "Clara." "Ethan, listen to me." She stood too, and she was not a tall woman, but she held his gaze with everything she had. "If they're working together, there's a paper trail. Carlyle can't share confidential bank records with a private buyer without something documenting it. That kind of arrangement leaves marks. We don't have access to the bank's records. We have access to ours," she said. "And if Moss knew the exact amount we're behind, if he quoted you a specific number, then he got that number from somewhere. And wherever he got it, there's a record of how." Ethan stood in the middle of the kitchen with his fists at his sides and his jaw hard, and the full weight of what she was saying landing on him in a way she could see happening in real time. "What do you need?" he said. "Everything Carlyle has given you in writing since October," she said. "Every letter, every assessment, every formal communication from the bank. And I need to know if Moss said anything specific, any number, any detail that he shouldn't have been able to know without inside information." Ethan went to his office. He came back with a folder. Clara sat down and opened it. She found the thread in 40 minutes. It was small. It was almost nothing. But she had been trained by a precise man in a precise profession to understand that the smallest inconsistency was always the place where the larger truth was hiding. In Carlyle's October letter to Ethan, he had referenced a specific figure for the ranch's outstanding note balance, a correct figure precisely stated. Standard banking correspondence. In Moss's verbal offer, which Ethan confirmed and which Clara had him write down word for word while his memory was fresh, the speculator had referenced a number that was not the current outstanding balance. It was the projected balance. For spring, after the cattle loss. A number that did not yet exist in any formal bank document. A number that could only exist if someone had been doing private projections based on non-public information about Walker Ranch's operations. Clara looked at that number for a long time. "He didn't just get access to the current records," she said almost to herself. "Someone has been feeding him projections, running numbers on the side, building a case for why this ranch would be at risk before the risk was confirmed." Ethan leaned over her shoulder and looked at where she was pointing. He was quiet for a very long time. "That's premeditated," he said. "Yes," she said. "This isn't opportunism. They saw the storm damage and moved faster, but the plan existed before the storm." She looked up at him. "Someone has been watching this ranch for longer than we knew." "Harlan," he said. Clara looked at him. 4 years, Ethan said. "Harlan was supplying the ranch for 4 years. He knew our operation. He knew our margins. He knew our seasonal patterns." His voice had gone very quiet. "When I cut him off in October, he didn't just lose a supply contract." "He went to Moss," Clara said. The room was absolutely still. "He sold them everything he knew," Ethan said. "And Moss took it to someone at the bank who was willing to work with him," Clara said. "Carlyle is new. He came in from the regional office, which means he has no loyalty to this town and no history with this ranch. Just a salary and an opportunity." Ethan pulled out the chair next to her and sat down. He sat down, which he did not always do when there was trouble. He usually paced. The fact that he sat down told her something about where he was, that the anger had reached a place past action and needed to settle before it could become useful. "Tell me what we do," he said. And just like that, 3 words, simple and direct, Ethan Walker handed her something he had never handed anyone in 11 years of running this ranch alone. He handed her the problem, not to fix for him, not to handle so he didn't have to, but the way you handed something to a partner, with trust. With the absolute, uncomplicated faith that she would treat it as carefully as he would. Clara straightened the papers in front of her. "We need a witness," she said. "Someone who can confirm that Moss and Carlyle had a prior relationship before October. Someone who saw them together, heard them talk, knows something that puts them in contact before the bank assessment began. In Willow Creek, Ethan said. Who would know that? Someone at the hotel, she said. They met outside it, which means they were both staying there or meeting there regularly. The hotel staff see everything and say nothing because their job depends on discretion. She paused. But discretion and loyalty aren't the same thing, and if I ask the right questions to the right person. Who do you know at the hotel? Edna Marsh's niece works the morning desk. Ethan looked at her. Edna is the woman at the general store, Clara said. The one whose husband Harlan cheated 4 years ago. Her niece has been there long enough to know regular guests from occasional ones. She paused. She might know something she doesn't know she knows. The ghost of something moved across Ethan's face. Not quite a smile, but something in that direction. You built that relationship on purpose, he said. I built it because Edna was kind to me when she didn't have to be, Clara said. But yes, I remember things. I store them. I don't always know why until I need to. Ethan looked at her for a long, steady moment. When can you go? Tomorrow morning, she said, before the bank opens. I'll come with you. No, she said. 2 people asking questions looks like an investigation. 1 person asking looks like conversation. She met his eyes. Let me do this the way I know how. He held her gaze. She watched him weigh at the instinct to be there to handle it himself against the knowledge that she was right. All right, he said. She nodded and went back to the papers. They worked for another 2 hours, organizing everything they had into an order that told the clearest possible story. When they finally stopped, it was past 10, and the house was cold except near the fire, and Clara's eyes ached from the close work. She was gathering the papers into a neat stack when Ethan said, What made you look for the inconsistency in the numbers? Most people wouldn't have caught that. She considered how to answer honestly. My employer in Cincinnati had a client who tried to do something similar to him, she said. A competitor who got access to his supplier contracts through a corrupt clerk and used the information to undercut him systematically over 2 years. She straightened the last page. Mr. Garrett almost lost the company before he understood what was happening. After that, he taught me to look for the thing that shouldn't be there. The number that's slightly too precise. The information that arrived too early. And you've been looking for it ever since. I look for it everywhere, she said. Habit. Ethan was quiet. Clara, he said. She looked at him. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to be honest with me. I'm always honest with you. Are you still here because of the arrangement? He said. The 3 months we agreed to. The question landed in the quiet room, and neither of them moved. She looked at his face. At the directness of it, the way he was asking the question he actually wanted the answer to instead of the easier one. No, she said. He held her gaze. I'm here because I want to be here, she said. Because this ranch is as real to me as it is to you. Because these men, Tommy and Pete, and all of them matter to me. Because the work matters. She paused. And because you are... She stopped. Because I am what? He said, quietly, carefully. She held his gaze for a moment longer than she planned to. Worth staying for, she said. The silence that followed was the most complete one she had ever been inside. Not empty. The opposite of empty. Ethan Walker looked at her with something open in his face that she had not seen there before. Something that had not been there at the train station, or in the front room, or at the kitchen table over the ledger. Something that was simply present. Unguarded. There in the way that a man was there when he had stopped trying to be somewhere else. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just that. His hand over hers, warm and rough and steady. He didn't say anything. She didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long moment. 2 people who had come to this place from opposite directions and found each other somewhere in the middle of the work and the difficulty and the slow daily accumulation of trust. And Clara felt something inside her chest, that she had been carefully not feeling for weeks settle into place with a quiet, definitive certainty. This was not arrangement anymore. This had not been arrangement for a long time. She was the one who moved first, finally picking up the last paper and setting it on the stack. "I'll leave early tomorrow," she said. "I'll be back before noon." Ethan pulled his hand back. "I'll have the wagon ready." She stood up, gathered the papers, moved toward the hallway. "Clara." She turned. He was still sitting at the table, both hands around his coffee cup, looking at her with that open, unguarded look. "Come back safe," he said. She looked at him. At the set of his face, and the steadiness of his eyes, and the particular way he held himself when he was being careful with something he was not ready to lose. "I will," she said. She went down the hall to her room and closed the door and stood in the dark for a moment, both hands flat on the door behind her, and let the feeling be as large as it actually was. She had come here with a worn suitcase and a letter, and a chin she refused to lower. She had not come here for love. But love, she was beginning to understand, did not particularly care what you came for. The next morning she found Emma Marsh behind the hotel desk at 7:45, before the day manager came in the brief window when the lobby was quiet and unhurried. She asked her questions the way she had learned to ask questions, not as questions, but as conversation. She mentioned that she'd seen some familiar faces around town lately. She mentioned Carlyle in passing, as a man she'd met at the bank. She let Emma talk, and Emma, who was 23 and observant and lonely, in the way that people who worked morning desks in small-town hotels were lonely, talked. What she said among other things was, the two men had taken meals together in the hotel dining room on 3 separate occasions in October. Before Carlyle's first official visit to Walker Ranch. Before any formal bank assessment had begun. She said it as a fact, not as significance. She had not known it was significant. Clara thanked her warmly, genuinely, and meant every word. She was back at the ranch by 10:30. She walked into the kitchen where Ethan was waiting, standing. Not sitting, which meant he had been standing there for a while, and she put the information on the table between them, like the piece it was the piece that completed the picture. 3 meals together before the assessment began, she said. Confirmed. Ethan looked at her. "That's enough," he said. "It's enough to take to the territorial bank examiner," she said. "It's not a court of law, but it's enough to trigger an investigation, and an investigation is enough to stop Carlyle from acting against us until the arrangement is examined." "And Moss. Moss is the easier one in the end," she said. "He's a speculator. He does business across 3 territories. He cannot afford to be named in a bank fraud investigation. Even the suggestion of it will make every landowner in Montana refuse to deal with him." She met Ethan's eyes. "He'll back off the moment we show him we know. You want to confront him. I want to let him know quietly that we have a meeting scheduled with the territorial examiner next week," she said. "Nothing accusatory, just a fact, and then watch what he does." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "How did you know to push back instead of run?" She thought about it honestly. "Because people like Moss are only brave when they think they're invisible," she said. "The moment you show them you can see what they're doing, they find somewhere else to be." Ethan nodded slowly. "And Carlyle," he said. "Carlyle is the bank's problem now," she said. "The moment the examiner gets involved, Carlyle will be the one running." He sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. She had learned to read his silences, and this one was not defeat or uncertainty. This one was a man arriving at the end of a long road and finding it was not the cliff he had feared. "We're going to be all right," she said. "Not as comfort, as fact." He looked at her. "Because of you." "Because of us," she said. "That's the difference." He held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "That's the difference." The meeting with the territorial bank examiner was scheduled for the 2nd Thursday of January. Between the day Clara made the appointment and the day it actually arrived, 11 days passed. 11 days in which Walker Ranch continued to function the way it always had. Cattle fed fences, checked supplies, managed meals cooked. Except that now everything had a second layer underneath it, a low constant hum of waiting that both of them felt, and neither of them spoke about more than was necessary. Ethan rode into town the morning after Clara identified the pattern and delivered the message to Gerald Moss himself. He did it the way he did everything, without theater, without threat, in the direct language of a man who had no interest in being misunderstood. He found Moss at the hotel and told him simply that Walker Ranch had retained documentation of certain irregular communications and had scheduled a review with the regional banking examiner for the following week. He said it the way a man announced the weather, factual, unapologetic. He told Clara about it that evening. "What did Moss say?" she asked. "Not much." Ethan poured his own coffee for once, which was something she had noticed him starting to do, small domestic acts that said he was becoming comfortable in the kitchen in a way he hadn't been before. He smiled, said he wasn't sure what I was referring to, said he wished me well with the ranch. And then he paid his hotel bill the next morning and left town. Clara looked at him. "That fast," she said. "That fast." Ethan sat down. "You were right. The moment he knew we could see him, there was nothing to stay for." She had known she was right. Knowing it still felt different from hearing it confirmed, there was a satisfaction in it that she allowed herself for exactly one moment before she set it aside, because satisfaction was something you felt after the whole thing was done, not in the middle. "Carlyle is still there," she said. "Carlyle is still there," Ethan agreed. "But without Moss pushing the acquisition, there's no incentive for him to accelerate the bank's timeline. He'll wait to see what the examiner finds." He paused. "And if he's smart, he'll start covering his tracks." "Which means we need to move before he does," Clara said. "The appointment is in 11 days. "I know. I want to prepare properly." Ethan looked at her. "What do you need?" "Everything organized," she said. "Every document we have that shows the timeline. The ledger inconsistencies from Harlan's invoices, which establish the pattern of outside interference with the ranch's finances. Emma's testimony about the 3 meals, which establishes a prior relationship between Moss and Carlyle before the formal assessment began. She was already thinking through it in sequence the way she thought through numbers. And I want a letter from Edna Marsh about what Harlan did to her husband's business, because it establishes that Harlan Beecham has a documented history of this exact behavior." Ethan was quiet, watching her. "You're building a case," he said. "I'm building a record," she said. "The examiner isn't a judge. He doesn't find people guilty. But he can flag an assessment as compromised, and a compromised assessment cannot be the basis for a foreclosure proceeding." She looked up. "If we give him enough to flag it, the bank has to start over with a clean examiner. And a clean examiner looking at this ranch's actual history will not find grounds for the kind of pressure Carlyle was applying." Silence. "You've done this before," Ethan said. "It was not a question." "No," she said. "But I watched Mr. Garrett do it, and I paid attention." Ethan set down his coffee. "Clara," he said. She looked at him. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at her with that steady, open expression that she had come to recognize as his version of saying something he couldn't quite find the words for yet. "I'm going to need you to know something," he said finally. She waited. "Before you came here," he said, "I thought I had built something solid, something that didn't need anything else." He looked at the table. "I thought the walls I'd built were strength. I thought working alone was discipline." He paused. "I was wrong about both of those things, and I want you to know that I know I was wrong." Clara looked at him steadily. "I know you know," she said. "You show me every day." He looked up. "That's not enough." "Ethan, let me finish," he said, quietly but firmly. "When you arrived at that station, I treated you like a problem I had agreed to take on. I was not cruel, but I was not present. And you came here anyway. You stayed, you worked. You built something here with your own hands when I gave you nothing to work with." His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath the level. I've been trying to find the right words for weeks, and I don't think there are right words. I just want you to know that I see it. All of it. Every morning you got up before the sun, and every night you sat at that table with me, and every time you pushed back when I was wrong. He held her gaze. I see it. The kitchen was very quiet. The 3 months are up, she said. Her voice was steady, but only because she made it steady. They were up 2 weeks ago, he said. I know. She looked at him. I didn't bring it up because I didn't want to have a conversation about the arrangement. Neither did I, he said. For the same reason. A beat. Because, she said. Because what's here now isn't an arrangement, he said. And I didn't want to discuss it in those terms. Clara pressed her hands flat on the table. She could feel her heart doing something entirely undignified, and she was not a woman who permitted undignified things without at least acknowledging them privately. What terms would you like to use? She asked. Ethan Walker reached across the table. He put his hand over hers again, the way he had done that night 2 weeks ago, deliberate, warm, certain. Whatever terms you choose, he said. But I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs managing, not because the 3 months aren't up, because I want you here, in this house, in this life. He held her gaze. Because somewhere between the supply lists and the ledger, and the feed run in the cold, you became the person this ranch is built around. Clara looked at his hand over hers. She thought about the train station, the worn suitcase, the chin she had kept level. She thought about the 11 days ahead, and the examiner, and the documents she still needed to organize. She thought about Tommy's laugh, and Pete's sideways approval, and Edna Marsh saying, I'm glad someone caught him, and the way the morning light came through the east window of her room every single day, and felt without her deciding it would like home. Yes, she said. Just that. One word. Ethan's hand tightened over hers. Neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. Some things were smaller and more complete when they weren't dressed up in extra words. Teg. The examiner arrived on a Thursday with 2 assistants and a leather satchel that meant serious business. His name was Thomas Harding, and he was the kind of man whose age was difficult to pin down somewhere between 50 and 60. Compact with sharp eyes behind silver-framed glasses, and the manner of someone who had seen every variety of human creative dishonesty and had consequently stopped being surprised by any of it. He shook Ethan's hand, and then Clara's, and when he shook hers, he looked at her with a slightly different attention than the one he'd given Ethan, the kind of attention that said he had been told something about her before arriving. Mrs. Walker, he said. It was the first time anyone had called her that. She kept her expression exactly level. Mr. Harding, thank you for making the trip. He was not there to be thanked. He went to the front room. Ethan had cleared the large table for the meeting and opened his satchel and got to work. Clara laid the documentation out in the order she had prepared Harlan's invoices going back 4 years, with the pattern annotated in her own hand in the margins. The ledger projections, Carlyle's letters, Emma Marsh's written statement, which Clara had helped her draft 2 days earlier, clear and specific and factual. Edna Marsh's letter regarding Harlan Beecham's conduct toward her husband's business, and a timeline she had constructed herself, a single page, showing the sequence of events from Carlyle's arrival in October through Moss's departure from town, with every key date and communication marked. Harding looked at the timeline first. He picked it up and read it twice. She watched him read it. He was thorough. He went back to the top and read the key dates again. Then he set it down and looked at her. You prepared this, he said. Yes. What was your occupation before coming to Montana? Mrs. Walker. Bookkeeping. Import accounting. He picked up the annotated ledger next. He spent a long time with it. One of his assistants leaned over occasionally to look at the page he was on, and twice Harding said something in a low voice, and the assistant wrote it down. Ethan sat at the end of the table the whole time, straight-backed and still. Clara sat beside him. She had her hands folded in her lap, which was the position she had learned to hold in tense situations. It kept them from moving, and moving hands told people more than you wanted them to know. After 40 minutes, Harding set down the last document. The prior relationship between the assessment officer and the acquiring party is the central issue, he said. 3 documented meals before the formal assessment began. That alone is grounds for a procedural review. He looked at Ethan. Do you have any additional documentation of direct communication between Carlyle and Beecham, the original supplier? No, Ethan said. We don't need it, Clara said. Both men looked at her. Beecham's pattern of conduct is established independently, she said. The fraud against the Marsh business. The invoice irregularities at Walker Ranch. That history demonstrates a willingness to provide confidential business information to outside parties for personal gain. You don't need to prove he gave information to Carlyle specifically. You need to establish that he had the information, that he had a motive to share it, and that Carlyle and Moss had access to him. She paused. The 3 meals between Moss and Carlyle connect them. The Marsh documentation connects Beecham to the practice of disclosure. The invoice records connect Beecham to Walker Ranch over 4 years. She kept her voice even. The chain exists even if each individual link is circumstantial. Harding looked at her for a long moment. You're not a lawyer, he said. No, she said. You should consider it, he said, and went back to his notes. Ethan beside her was very still. She could feel him not looking at her, which was its own kind of looking. The formal review took 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Walker Ranch continued. That was the thing about a working ranch. It didn't pause for legal proceedings or personal revelations or the slow settling of feelings that had been building for months. The cattle needed feeding regardless of what the territorial banking examiner was doing with his satchel in Billings. The winter supply contract with the fort needed managing. The books needed keeping. Clara kept them. She kept everything she always kept, and Ethan kept everything he always kept. And in between the keeping they had dinner together every evening and coffee in the mornings, and the particular easy silence of 2 people who had stopped managing the space between them. One evening in the 3rd week, Pete knocked on the back door of the kitchen. Clara opened it. He stood there, with his hat in his hands. Pete, who had never stood with his hat in his hands, in her presence before, because Pete expressed himself through actions rather than gestures. Wanted to say something, he said. Come in, she said. I'll say it here. He looked at the hat in his hands, then at her. When Ethan said he was getting a mail-order bride, I thought... He stopped. Well, I won't repeat what I thought. I can imagine, she said. What I think now, Pete said, is that this ranch hasn't run this well since Ethan's father was alive. And the reason is you. And I wanted you to know that someone noticed who isn't 19 years old and doesn't just notice the stew. Clara looked at him, at the weathered face and the serious eyes and the hat turning in his hands. Pete, she said. Ma'am? Thank you, she said. That means a great deal. He put his hat back on and went back to the bunkhouse without another word. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, the cold air coming in from outside, and felt something she recognized as the particular uncomplicated warmth of being known by people who didn't give that knowledge lightly. She told Ethan about it at dinner. He was quiet for a moment. Pete doesn't say things like that, he said. I know. He didn't say it when my father died. Didn't say it when we had the bad year in '84. Didn't... He stopped. He's been here 18 years. I know, Clara said again. Ethan looked at his plate, then at her. That's the highest thing he could have said. He told her. I understood that, she said. He picked up his fork. She picked up hers. And in the comfortable, ordinary quiet of 2 people having dinner, something settled between them that was beyond words and better than most of them. The result from the banking examiner came on a Friday. Harding wrote to Ethan directly, a formal letter precisely worded, the kind of document that said exactly what it meant and nothing it didn't mean. The assessment conducted by Officer James Carlisle had been flagged for procedural irregularities. The assessment was suspended pending a full internal review by the Regional Banking Authority. Walker Ranch's note status was hereby frozen at its current terms, pending the outcome of the review, which meant no acceleration, no new pressure, no grounds for foreclosure action during the period of the investigation. Carlisle had been placed on administrative leave pending the review. There was a second shorter paragraph at the bottom. Harding's personal addition outside the formal language. It said, "The documentation provided by Mrs. Walker was among the most clearly organized and logically presented evidentiary packages I have reviewed in 22 years of this work. Please convey my professional compliments." Ethan read the letter standing in the front room. He read it twice. Then he walked to the kitchen doorway where Clara was working, and he held the letter out to her without saying anything. She read it. She read Harding's personal paragraph twice. She set the letter down on the counter. She pressed her lips together for a moment, not because she was sad, but because she was not going to cry in the kitchen over a bank examiner's letter, regardless of what the bank examiner's letter contained. "All right," she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. She cleared it. "All right, good." Ethan was still standing in the doorway. "Come here," he said. She looked at him. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her and held her simply and completely, the way a man held someone he had been wanting to hold for a long time and had been waiting until the moment was not complicated by everything else. Clara stood very still for exactly 1 second. Then she put her arms around him and held on. She had not been held like this since before her mother died, since before everything that had come after. She had not understood until this moment how much of herself she had been holding up by the sheer force of her own spine. She let out a long, quiet breath against his shoulder. "We did it," he said. "We did," she said. He did not let go immediately. Neither did she. They stood in the warm kitchen in the middle of the afternoon with the letter on the counter and the fire going, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch all around them, and Clara thought this. This is what it was all for, not the victory, this. When they finally separated, Ethan kept his hands on her shoulders for a moment. He looked at her face with the direct, unguarded look that she loved most, that she had admitted to herself alone in her room in the evenings that she loved this specific look that was only ever for her. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You've been saying that more often lately," she said. The corner of his mouth moved. "Have I?" "You have, and every time you say it, whatever comes next matters." "Then I'll just say it," he said. "Will you marry me? Actually marry me? Not as a contract, not as an arrangement, not for the ranch." His hands were warm on her shoulders. "Because I love you. Because this place is yours as much as it's mine. Because I cannot conceive of a single morning from here forward that I would want to start without you in it." Clara looked at him. She looked at his face, the weathered, careful, serious face of a man who had built walls for years and taken them down one brick at a time until they were standing exactly here. "You know what I thought about on the train coming here," she said. "What? I thought I am going to a place I have never been, to marry a man I have never met, and I have no idea if it will work." She held his gaze. "I thought I might be making the worst decision of my life, but I might also be making the only decision that ever makes sense." She paused. "And I decided that the second thing was more likely than the first." "Were you right?" he said. "Ask me every day for the rest of our lives, and the answer will be the same," she said. "Yes." He pulled her back in and held her again, and this time she didn't need even a second to decide to hold on. The wedding was on a Saturday in late February. It was small because they were not people who required an audience for the things that mattered. Tommy and Pete and the other hands, Edna Marsh and her husband. The minister from the church on the North Road who had known Ethan's father and shook Ethan's hand before the ceremony, with the particular emotion of a man who had hoped for this and not let himself say so. Margaret Holt came. Clara had not expected that. She saw her at the back of the small room, and for a moment she met her eyes, and Margaret Holt gave her a nod. Not effusive, not an apology, just a nod, the kind that said, "I see you now." Properly. Clara nodded back. That was enough. The ceremony was short and honest. The minister asked the words that ministers asked, and Ethan said what he meant, and Clara said what she meant. And when it was done, Ethan Walker took her hand, the way he had started taking it in the evenings recently, without announcement, without asking, simply because it was where his hand wanted to be. Afterward, at the small gathering at the ranch, Tommy made a toast that was enthusiastic and slightly incomprehensible and enormously sincere. Pete said nothing, but he shook Ethan's hand, and then, after a brief internal deliberation visible on his face, shook Clara's hand too, which from Pete was equivalent to a standing ovation. Edna Marsh found Clara near the end of the evening. "I wanted to say," Edna said, "that what you did with Harding's office, the way you put that case together, my husband said it's the kind of thing a trained lawyer would have done." "Mr. Garrett would be pleased to hear it," Clara said. "Who's Mr. Garrett?" "The man who taught me that the truth is always in the numbers," Clara said. "And that the numbers always talk if you listen long enough." Edna smiled. "Well," she said, "I'm glad you listened." She moved away. Clara stood alone for a moment in the room full of people she had come to know over the past months, people who had become without her planning it, or even fully noticing it until now, her people. Ethan found her. He stood beside her and looked at the room, his hands the land, the men who kept it running, and she felt him breathe. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. He put his hand in hers. "I have something to tell you," he said. She looked at him. "The bank sent a letter today. The formal review is complete." His voice was steady, but she could hear the particular quality under the steady. "Carlyle has been dismissed. The note has been reset to the original terms, with an additional year added as a formal acknowledgement of the irregular conduct." He paused. "We're not just safe. We're ahead of where we were when this started." Clara absorbed this. "That means the Fort contract payment comes in clear," she said. "It does. And the spring count will put us above Carlyle's original target." "It will. By summer we'll be—" "Clara," he said. She stopped. "We're standing at our wedding," he said. She looked at him. The corner of his mouth moved. "The numbers will still be there tomorrow." She laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and it came out genuine and warm and slightly surprised, and Ethan Walker looked at her when she laughed the way he always looked at her, like she was the most real thing in the room. "You're right," she said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." He squeezed her hand. "It's one of my favorite things about you. My inability to stop thinking about numbers. The fact that you're always thinking about how to make things better," he said. "Even now. Even today." She looked at him. At his face in the warm light, the serious eyes and the small smile that she had earned. She felt one patient, careful day at a time. "The numbers," she said quietly, "will always be there. But this—" She looked at the room, the people, the life that had assembled itself around her, without her quite realizing it was happening. "This won't always be the first time." He understood her. He always understood her. "No," he said. "It won't." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles briefly, simply, not for the room, but just for her, and Clara felt it all the way through. She thought about the train, the suitcase, the chin she had held level. She thought about everything that had come between that moment and this one. The ledger, the late nights, the cold morning of the feed run, the examiner's letter, the warm kitchen, the hand over hers. She had not come here looking for this, but she had come here honestly, and she had stayed honestly, and she had worked honestly, and what had come back to her was something honest in return. Real love. She understood now was not the thing that arrived with trumpets and proclamations. It was the thing that grew in the space between two people who kept choosing to be present with each other, who kept showing up, who kept being honest, even when honest was harder than the alternative. It was built in kitchens and ledgers and cold morning yards and long nights over difficult numbers. It was built exactly like this. Spring came to Walker Ranch the way it always came to Montana. Not gently, not all at once, but in fits and starts. A warm day followed by a cold night, followed by a morning where the air smelled different, and you understood without being told that something had shifted permanently. Clara noticed it first. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, not as a single dramatic moment, but as an accumulation of small facts that added up to something larger. The way the ground sounded different underfoot, the way the cattle moved differently in the south pasture, the way Ethan came in from the early check one morning and sat down at the kitchen table and said without preamble, "Grass is coming in on the east section." "How early?" she asked. 2 weeks ahead of last year." She poured his coffee and set it in front of him and sat down across from him. And they looked at each other the way two people looked at each other when good news arrived after a long, difficult winter, not with explosion, but with the deep, quiet satisfaction of something earned. "The fort delivery is complete," she said. "Final shipment went yesterday. And the payment clears by Friday. Thursday, if Harding's office processes it on schedule." She opened the ledger, still kept in the kitchen, still the most used item in the house after the coffee pot, and ran the column she had already run twice in her head. "That puts us $42 above the revised bank target, before the spring count." Ethan wrapped both hands around his cup. "When the spring count comes in, we'll be significantly ahead," she said. "Enough to start discussing the North Pasture expansion." He looked at her. "I haven't said anything to you about the North Pasture." "No," she said. "But Pete mentioned it 3 weeks ago, and then you rode up that way twice last week without any operational reason, and I've seen you looking at the survey maps in your office." She kept her expression neutral. "I can wait until you're ready to bring it up officially." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Then he shook his head slowly, with the particular expression she had come to love most on his face, the one that was halfway between exasperation and something much warmer, the one that said she had gotten there before him again, and he had stopped being surprised by it. "The North Pasture," he said, "could add capacity for another 120 head. "I know," she said. "I've been running the numbers." "Of course you have. The acquisition cost is manageable if we time it to the fall, after the summer revenue lands and before the winter expenses start. There's a window of about 6 weeks where the cash position supports the purchase without straining anything else." Ethan looked at her. "6 weeks," he said. "August 15th to the end of September," she said, "give or take." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about it since February," he said. "I hadn't worked out the timing yet." "I know," she said. "That's why I did." He leaned back in his chair. He had the look of a man who was fully, deeply, genuinely content, not happy in the uncomplicated way of a man without problems, but settled in the way of a man who knew exactly where he was and wanted to be precisely there. "Clara," he said. "Ethan, what would I do without you?" "You would manage," she said. "You always managed." "That's not the same thing." "No," she said softly. "It's not." Tommy turned 20 in April, and Clara organized a birthday supper in the bunkhouse that Tommy later described to anyone who would listen as the best meal he had eaten in his life, which was probably an exaggeration, but not an enormous one. She made his mother's recipe. She had asked him about it 2 weeks earlier in the way she had of asking things that didn't seem like questions, mentioning food in passing, letting him fill in the details. And he had told her about the chicken and dumplings his mother made every birthday, and she had filed it away. When he came in from the evening check and found it waiting on the table, he stopped in the doorway. He didn't say anything for a moment. "Miss Clara," he said finally. He had never fully made the transition to calling her Mrs. Walker, and she didn't push it, because she understood that some habits were really attachments in disguise. "How did you know?" "You told me," she said. I didn't think you. He stopped. I didn't think I said enough for you to actually. You said enough, she said. He sat down. He ate. And at one point in the middle of the meal, when the table was noisy with the other men, and someone was telling a story about a fence post and a very stubborn bull, Clara looked down the table and saw Tommy eating his birthday chicken and dumplings with an expression on his face that was trying very hard not to be moved and failing completely. She looked away before he noticed her noticing. That was the other thing she had learned at Walker Ranch, that tact sometimes meant looking away at exactly the right moment. Ethan was leaning against the wall at the end of the bunkhouse, watching the table with his coffee in his hand, and when Clara moved to stand beside him, he said quietly without looking at her, "He hasn't had a birthday supper since he left home." "I know," she said. "How do you know?" "Because he never mentioned one," she said. "People talk about the good things they have. They go quiet about the things they miss." Ethan looked at her sideways. "You do that too," he said. "Go quiet about things." She considered this. "Sometimes." "What do you go quiet about?" She was quiet for a moment, which she realized was exactly what he had just described. "My mother," she said. "She would have loved this place, the size of it, the way the sky goes on." She looked at the table. She always said the sky in Ohio was too small. Ethan stood beside her in silence. Then, "Tell me about her." Clara looked at him. He was looking at the table, not at her, giving her the courtesy of not making it feel like a demand. She told him. Not everything. Not all at once, just the shape of her mother, the woman who had raised 4 children on a schoolteacher's wage, and never once suggested that any of them should expect less than everything they were willing to work for. The way she kept the books for the household with the same seriousness that a bank kept accounts, because she understood that money was just time made visible, and time was not something you wasted. The way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished them every single time, which should have been annoying and somehow wasn't. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "You would have," Clara said. "She didn't tolerate waste or pretension, and she made very good pie. You would have gotten along well." He almost smiled. High praise. From her it would have been. He put his arm around her shoulders, easy and natural, the way he did things now, without announcement, and she leaned into him slightly, and they stood together, watching Tommy eat his birthday supper. And the bunkhouse was warm and loud, and entirely full of life. It was May when the letter arrived from Cincinnati. Clara recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she read the name, the precise angular script of a man who had spent 40 years putting numbers in columns and expected his letters to be as orderly as his ledgers. Mr. Garrett. She stood in the front yard holding the letter for a moment before she opened it. She had not written to him when she left Cincinnati. She had written to almost no one when she left, because leaving had required a certain forward momentum that backward glances tended to interrupt. She had sent one letter to her sister in Columbus, and one to the agency that had arranged the mail order introduction, and that had been the sum of her correspondence. She had not thought about how he might have heard what had happened. She opened the letter. It was 2 pages, which for Garrett was the equivalent of an emotional outpouring. He had heard he wrote from a business associate in Billings about the matter of the Territorial Banking Review. He had heard, and here his precision showed, because he said, "heard not learned," making the distinction between second-hand information and verified fact that a woman who had formerly worked in his accounting office had been instrumental in exposing a fraudulent arrangement between a bank examiner and a land speculator. He wanted her to know he wrote that in 22 years of business, he had never regretted a hiring decision less. He wanted her to know that if she ever had need of a professional reference, she had only to ask. He wanted her to know in the last paragraph, which was the only paragraph in which the precision slipped slightly, that he hoped she had found what she was looking for when she left Ohio. He suspected he wrote that she had found considerably more. Clara folded the letter. She sat down on the porch step and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she did something she had not done in a long time. Not from sadness, but from the particular emotion that had no clean name. The one that came when you understood that your life had moved from one chapter to another, and both chapters were real, and both of them were yours. She was still sitting there when Ethan came around from the barn. He saw her face and came directly to her without asking, sat down on the step beside her and waited. She gave him the letter. He read it. He read it slowly because Garrett's handwriting required patience. When he finished, he folded it the way she had folded it and gave it back. "He's proud of you," Ethan said. "He doesn't say that. He doesn't say anything directly, but that's what it means." She looked at the letter in her hands. "He taught me everything I know about records and patterns and how to find the thing that shouldn't be there." "Then he's partly responsible for saving this ranch," Ethan said. Clara looked at him. "He might appreciate knowing that," Ethan said. She thought about it. "I'll write to him," she said. "Good." She tucked the letter in her pocket. Ethan's hand found hers on the step between them. His particular way she had learned of saying things he didn't always put into words. She held it, and they sat together in the May morning while the ranch moved around them. "Ethan," she said. "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. She looked at their joined hands, then at him. "I'm going to need the east bedroom cleared out by October," she said. "The one we've been using for storage." A pause. She watched the information travel across his face, watched it land, watched him process it, watched the exact moment he understood what she was saying. He went very still. "Clara," he said. "October?" she said. "Maybe late September if the calculation is right, which it usually is." He looked at her, and Ethan Walker, who expressed himself through action and silence, and the economy of a man who had learned young that words cost something and should be spent carefully. Ethan Walker put both his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with everything he had spent 2 years carefully keeping behind the walls he'd built. "Clara," he said again. Just her name. But the way he said it this time held every version of it. The one from the train station, the one from the kitchen table, the one from the night of the examiner's letter, the one from their wedding, all of them compacted into 2 syllables. "The room needs to be cleared," she said, because she was not a woman who was comfortable being looked at with that much emotion without something practical to anchor herself to. He laughed. It came out sudden and full, the kind of laugh that was surprised out of a person. "I'll clear it this week," he said. "Good," she said. He pulled her toward him, and she let herself be pulled, and they sat on the porch step in the May morning, with his arms around her, and the ranch going on around them, and Clara closed her eyes and felt the particular unassuming certainty of a life that had become, without her quite orchestrating it, exactly the life she would have chosen. The summer was the best the ranch had seen in years. The spring count came in higher than projected. The North Pasture negotiation opened in August on schedule exactly as Clara had mapped it. The fort renewed their supply contract with a premium increase based on the reliability of the winter delivery. 3 of the ranch hands got raises, the first raises the operation had offered in 4 years, because Clara put the numbers in front of Ethan and showed him where the margin existed, and Ethan, who had always wanted to, and had not always been sure he could sign the payroll adjustment without hesitation. Tommy's raise made him stand in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, much the way Pete had stood 8 months earlier. "You don't have to do that," he said. "We know," Clara said. "We wanted to." He looked at her, then at Ethan, who was at the kitchen table with his coffee and his characteristic steadiness. "Sir," Tommy said, and the word carried more than its 4 letters could properly hold. "You've earned it," Ethan said. 3 times over. Tommy put his hat back on. He left. They heard him in the yard a moment later, and then the particular sound of someone walking faster than they needed to, because they needed the motion to contain what they were feeling. Pete appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later. "You gave Tommy a raise," he said. "We gave everyone a raise," Clara said. Pete looked at Ethan. "Good," Pete said. He left. Ethan looked at Clara. "That's the most enthusiasm Pete has ever shown for a financial decision," he said. That's because it was the right financial decision, she said. And Pete always knows which decisions are right. He just doesn't always say so. Like you, Ethan said. I say so, she protested. You say so after you've already done it, he said, which is not quite the same as asking. She considered this. Are you complaining? The corner of his mouth moved. Not even slightly. The biggest twist came in September, and it came from the last direction either of them expected. Margaret Holt knocked on the front door of Walker Ranch on a Tuesday morning, which was unusual. Margaret Holt coming alone without her usual practice social armor was something else entirely. Clara opened the door and saw her standing on the porch with an expression she had never seen on the woman's face before. Not the assessing look, not the careful social smile. Something stripped of all that. Mrs. Walker, she said. May I come in? Clara stepped back from the door. Margaret came in and sat in the front room and accepted tea and held the cup with both hands, the way people held things when they needed something to do with their hands while they said something difficult. I want to apologize, she said. Clara waited. When you arrived, Margaret said, I decided what you were before you had the chance to show me. I said things that were unkind. I said them in public, which made them worse. She looked at her cup. I told myself it was because I was protecting Ethan, protecting the town's interest in him. She paused. I think it was really because you frightened me. Clara looked at her. Frightened you how? You were so... Margaret stopped. So certain of yourself. Even at that first moment on the platform when he was cold and everyone was watching, you didn't break. She looked up. I have lived in this town for 30 years, and I have never been certain of myself the way you were certain of yourself in that moment. And I didn't know what to do with that. The room was very quiet. Clara set down her cup. Mrs. Holt, she said. I was not certain. I was terrified. Margaret looked at her. I had 1,200 miles of train ride to be terrified, Clara said. I had arrived in a place I had never been to, marry a man I had never met with one suitcase and whatever self-possession I could keep hold of. She held the older woman's gaze. I kept my chin level because I had nothing else to offer. Not because I wasn't afraid. Margaret Holt looked at her for a long time. I didn't know that, she said. Most people don't, Clara said. That's rather the point of keeping your chin level. Something shifted in Margaret's face, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way things shifted in people who were genuinely reconsidering something they had held for a long time. You saved this ranch, Margaret said. And 2 months before that you saved my husband's business partner's reputation, because the examiner's investigation also caught irregularities in 2 other accounts that Carlyle had been managing. She paused. My husband told me last week. He said if the investigation hadn't begun when it did, the damage would have spread to half the properties in the valley. Clara absorbed this. She had not known about the other accounts. I didn't know that, she said. You weren't supposed to, Margaret said. The bank kept it quiet. But we know. She straightened. And I wanted you to hear it from me directly. That what you did mattered beyond this ranch. Beyond you and Ethan. Clara looked at the woman across from her. The real woman, the one underneath the careful social performance, someone who had lived 30 years in a small town and made herself necessary to it, through attention and organization, and the particular energy of a person who needed to feel useful and had not always used that need wisely. Thank you for telling me, Clara said. And thank you for coming. Margaret set down her tea. She looked for a moment like she was going to say something else, something in a different register. Then she straightened again and smoothed her skirt and stood up, and the social armor settled back into place, but more lightly than before. Like a coat put on for the weather, rather than for the performance of it. I hope, she said at the door, that the baby is healthy. Clara looked at her. Word travels, Margaret said simply, and left. Clara stood in the front room for a moment, then she went to find Ethan. He was in the barn when she found him. She told him about Margaret's visit, and he listened with his full attention, the way he always listened now. And when she told him about the other bank accounts and the other properties, she watched the information settle into him, the way significant things settled, not like a stone dropped in water with immediate visible ripples, but like something absorbed becoming part of what he knew about the world. She came herself, he said. She came herself, Clara confirmed. That's not nothing for Margaret Holt. No, Clara said. It's not. He was quiet for a moment. She's right, you know, about the other properties. I spoke to Jenkins last week. He had heard something from the county office but didn't have the details. Why didn't you tell me? I was waiting until I had the whole picture. She looked at him. Habit, he said. Old habit. One you're working on, she said, not as a reprimand, just as a fact. One I'm working on, he agreed. She stepped toward him and he put his arm around her, and she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, her own particular way of saying things she didn't always put into words. October, she said. I know, he said. The room is cleared. I checked, she said. He laughed again. She felt it as much as heard it, the warm sound of a man who had been serious for so long that laughter still surprised him slightly when it arrived. 10. The baby came in the last week of September, which was earlier than Clara's calculation, and right on schedule, with the particular willfulness the child had apparently decided to demonstrate from the very beginning. Her name was Ruth, after Clara's mother. Ethan held her with the focused, careful attention of a man who understood that he was holding something for which no prior preparation was fully adequate, and was determined to be adequate anyway. He held her the way he held things that mattered, with both hands, with his full attention, with all of himself present. Clara watched him from the bed, tired in the profound total way that followed an enormous effort, and thought that she had never seen his face look quite like this. Not the open, unguarded look she loved. Something beyond that. Something that went further than anything she had a ready name for. Pete knocked on the bedroom door 2 hours later. Ethan opened it. Pete looked at the baby, then at Ethan, then at Clara. Ruth, Clara said. Good name, Pete said. He left. Tommy knocked 10 minutes after. He looked at the baby for a long moment. She's very small, he said. She'll get bigger, Clara said. Does she? He stopped. Does she have everything she needs? She has everything she needs, Ethan said. Tommy nodded. He looked at them both, at Ethan and Clara and the baby between them, and the look on his face was the same one he'd had at his birthday supper. The one that was trying not to be moved and failing completely. All right, he said. I'll be outside if you need anything. He closed the door. Clara looked at Ethan. You have very good men, she said. We have very good men, he said. She closed her eyes. He sat beside her, their daughter in his arms, and the ranch went on around them, the way it always went on, steady and relentless and full of life. And Clara listened to it, and felt in every part of herself that she was home. People in Willow Creek told the story for years afterward, not always accurately. Stories never stayed accurate for long in small towns, where each retelling added and subtracted according to what the teller found most meaningful. But the core of it remained. The core always remained, because the core was true, and true things had a way of surviving the alterations. They told it as the story of a cowboy who had forgotten how to want anything beyond the work. They told it as the story of a woman who arrived with a worn suitcase and chin level and the refusal to be made less than she was. They told it as the story of a ranch that should have been lost and wasn't. But the people who knew it best, Pete, who stayed on for 12 more years and never once mentioned retirement. Tommy, who grew into a foreman and then into a man who ran his own operation on the south end of the valley and named his first daughter Clara. Edna Marsh, who eventually told the whole story to her grandchildren with the authority of someone who had witnessed it firsthand and wanted the record to be correct. Those people told it differently. They told it as the story of two people who made a decision to be honest with each other and then kept making that decision every day until the decision became the kind of habit that was indistinguishable from love. They told it as the story of what it actually took to build something real, not luck, not ease, not arriving at the right moment, but showing up, staying, doing the work in front of you with everything you had, and trusting that the person beside you was doing the same. and Ruth Walker, who grew up on the ranch her father had built and her mother had saved, who learned numbers from Clara and cattle from Ethan, and the specific art of making people feel seen. From watching both of them do it every day, Ruth Walker told it as the simplest story of all. She told it as the story of a man who had stopped believing in love, and a woman who had never stopped believing in herself, and how those two facts put together turned out to be exactly enough. She told it the way her mother had taught her to tell things directly, honestly, without wasting words. She told it always with her chin level, because that was where it had started, and that was what it had always been about. Not the arrangement, not the agreement, not the contract that had brought a woman 1,200 miles across the country on a one-way ticket to a life she hadn't yet been able to imagine, but the choice made once then, again then, every day after, to be exactly where you were, with exactly who was beside you, and call that enough. Not because it was all there was, but because it was everything that mattered. And on Walker Ranch, in the last good light of a Montana evening, with cattle moving in the south pasture, and smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, and a child's laughter somewhere in the yard, Ethan Walker took his wife's hand the way he had started taking it on their wedding day, and never once stopped. And Clara Walker held on, because that was what you did with the things that were real. You held on, and you did not let go, and you built a life so solid and so true that even time itself could not take the shape of it away. That was the whole story, and it was enough.